Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today, I'm honoured to be speaking with Hannah Huesman. Hannah, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hey Dan, thanks for having me. I am excited to be here with you today.
Well, look, I'm super excited to have you on the Sports Psych Show. Really looking forward to having a chat about all things sports psych, mental skills, baseball, softball. Before we get started, why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, so I am originally from Nashville, Tennessee, and I went to college and played softball at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And I studied undergrad. I studied exercise science and really knew I was going to work in sports to some capacity, but just really didn't know how, and when and what and everything that looked like. So really started to do some research and thought I was going to do strength and conditioning. Thought I was going to be a softball coach, maybe even a basketball coach. And then my senior year of undergrad, I took an elective class that was basically an introduction to sports psych 101. And I was like, I don't know what this is. I've never heard of this. And I want to learn everything I possibly can about it. And that's kind of what lit my fire. And all of a sudden, I started doing a ton of research and found some awesome grad school programs and went to the University of Tennessee and got my master's from there in kinesiology with a concentration in sports psychology and motor behavior, which, as you know, is, a fancy way of saying how the mind and the body work together to produce optimal performance, which is exactly what I do on a daily basis. So I'm currently a mental skills coach for the Philadelphia Phillies, Major League Baseball organization. And I have been there for 3 years, and I work with all of those guys throughout our entire system, major leagues and minor league system, to help them get their brain to work for them instead of against them, and making sure they're training their mind as much as they're training their bodies, because they're working so hard physically. And I always say, my worst case scenario is physically you're ready and you get to the show and you get to the big leagues and you have your moment, and then mentally you're not prepared. And so our whole goal is to make sure we're being proactive in our approaches and making sure that they are getting stronger and tougher and more resilient mentally, just like they are working so hard physically. So that's what I do.
I love that notion, Hannah, of the brain working for them, not against them.
Mm-hmm.
And before we dive into some questions, I do want to say to the Sports Psych Show audience that we've had a few episodes where we've spoken about sports psychology for baseball. On episode 29, we had Sean Larkin on, who's the skills coordinator at the Dodgers. Episode 42, Lauren Johnson, who is the mental skills coordinator for the Yankees. Episode 76, Rob Cooper is the head coach at Penn State Baseball. And episode 97, none other than the brilliant Justine Seagal, who's the first woman ever to coach in men's baseball. So I'm learning loads about baseball. It's this Englishman who doesn't know a huge amount about the sport, disgraceful as it is. I tell you what, I'd actually rather start with a bit of softball here. I'm always inquisitive about sports psychologists, mental skills coaches, how strong they were, how tough they were, or how skillful they were mentally in their own playing career. So I'm being a little bit nosy here, Hannah, but I hope you can forgive me. Give me a mark out of 10 for the mental side of your game when you were playing college softball, and what was strong and what, when you reflect back, could have been better.
Okay, so I think when I look back at my softball career, I thought I was very mentally tough and I thought I could do a lot of things. But looking back now, I was like, I had no clue what I was doing and how I was doing it. I was just kind of, naturally, I feel like my brother and I were raised super competitive by my parents and, taught to be resilient and taught to, never quit. But it was a whole lot of like, work really hard and the results will come. Like, if you're the hardest working person, everything will work out. And that was kind of my mentality. And of course, to some extent that worked, and then to other extents that didn't work. And I remember never feeling as confident as I should have in my ability back then. And that's one of the things I talk about a lot, is when people ask me the one thing I wish I would have known then that I know now, and it's like to be your own source of confidence. right? Because back then I was looking so hard from coaches, parents, significant others, teammates to just say like, hey, you're doing a good job. Like, you got this. You're good enough. You're smart enough. You're strong enough, whatever it was. And the reality of it is, like, that had to come from inside me. You know, if they would say that, it would last all of 30 seconds and I'd feel good and then it'd go away. And it was like, where is that internal motivation, that internal confidence coming from that I can't find, that I wasn't able to create for myself? So, as much as I wish I could say like 10 out of 10, so mentally tough, I'd give myself literally probably a 5 out of 10. Like, natural, like very competitive, very hardworking, like knew how to be resilient, but like didn't have total control over it. You know, sometimes it would be there and be great, and other times it was nowhere to be found. So I think it was there, but there wasn't the, I guess a great way to say it is the what was there, right? I knew what I needed to do. I knew I needed to be motivated. I knew I needed to be confident. I knew I needed to be resilient, but I didn't always necessarily know how to do it. And I sure as heck didn't know why I was supposed to be doing that, you know? And so I'm going to give myself a little credit, but not a whole lot.
It's interesting, isn't it, Hannah? What I sort of derive from that is maybe when you answered that question when you were in college, you might have given yourself 7, 8, 9 out of 10 for the mental side.
Yeah,
But it sounds like what you know now about the mental side, you know, being a mental skills coach, when you reflect back, actually, there were so many things you could have done to potentially have got even better at that side of the game.
definitely, without a doubt. And I didn't know it then. Again, like, you know, we had one experience where I believe a clinical psychologist came in and gave us one assessment, and basically it was like, come find him to get the results. And I was like, I
Mm.
never saw him again. You know what I mean? Like, it was like, it wasn't regular touches, it wasn't conversations. And so at first I was like, this is a thing, you know, it would honestly potentially could have rubbed me the wrong way from the very beginning, but I didn't really give it two thoughts longer than I had to. So, but yeah, without a doubt, I would have thought a lot better back then. But it's fun, and I love thinking back on that and how different it would have been, which motivates me to help others, you know, get what I didn't have back then, when, because I discovered it my last semester of my college career. So I literally, you know, had 3 or 4 months left of my softball playing career ever. And it was almost, it helped a little bit, I think, but almost too far, too gone. So
3 or 4 months out of a 4 year
yeah,
program.
yeah,
That's a
exactly.
little bit late in the day, but
Yeah.
it's. I suppose when you reflect back, there can be a source of frustration there, can't there? Because you mentioned one clinical site coming in doing a random test. I mean, it
Hmm.
feels so. I talk about integration versus isolation, and the historical context of sports psychology has been the isolated element of it, rather than integrated.
Hmm.
Um, but the landscape's not looking so bleak now, isn't it? I mean, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in the US, there seems to be a lot more programs now, whether it's in the MLB, whether it's in the NFL, NBA. There seems to be a lot more integration. Mental skills coaches, sports psychologists seem to be integrated into these teams.
Yes, and it was funny because I didn't really understand the importance of that concept until I got to be a part of a team. And
Mm.
my actually, as soon as I got out of grad school, I had my first internship was with the Pittsburgh Pirates organization, and I remember there Bernie Holiday is running that mental skills program, mental conditioning program there, and he told me from the very beginning, like, the priorities were number one, culture, number two, coaches, and number three, the players. And like right out of grad school, I'm like, what? Like, no, like players should be number one. You know, like we're here to work with the players, but just like you said, like if we're not integrated, if we aren't considered a part of the culture, it's always going to be this isolated addition at the end of the day, or like only when you really quote unquote need it, right? Only when things are going really wrong do you need to go talk to the mental skills coach, the sports psychologist, right? And now, and that's been one of my biggest goals working with the Phillies, is to make sure, like, if you are a Phillies baseball player, like, you are going to be working on your mental skills as much, if not the same amount as the physical skills, like without a doubt. And by doing that, it's like not a question, right? People are like, oh, you're going to go meet with Hannah? Okay, yeah, I'm right after you. You know, it's not this negative stigma, right? It takes away all of the negative pieces and makes it this positive thing that, like, oh, yeah, in order to be our best, we have to work on our mental side of our game too. And this is something that we do. This is the norm. This is part of who we are. No questions asked. And so it didn't make sense back then, but now it's there's no way we could do the work we're doing and feel included and feel part of the culture and make it a part of who we are without it being integrated, just like you said. So funny to see how that comes along.
Yeah, I mean, integrated, another word here, normalize. It sounds like
Hmm.
the coaches at Philadelphia have done a really great job of striving to normalize the notion of mental skills and sports psychology within the culture. Now, we as sports psychs and mental skills coaches, we can preach from the pulpit and talk about the importance of integration, but we also have to respect the fact that not every team, club, has the kind of resources that, say, a Premier League soccer club has, or an MLB club, or an NBA club. So we have to respect the fact that there are thousands, if not millions, of coaches out there, grassroots coaches and grassroots players and developing elite players who don't necessarily have access to mental skills coaches. And this kind of leads me neatly on to what I primarily want to talk about today. I mean, I've known about your work, but I found you on Twitter and really enjoy some of the tweets that you throw out, especially some of the videos. And some of those videos are called Mental Sweat Mondays. And rather than me ramble on about what Mental Sweat Mondays are, I think we'll get you to introduce these. What are they, Hannah? How long have you been doing them for? Take us through them a little bit.
Yeah. So Mental Sweat Monday, that's the kind of hashtag that we came up with, and my husband helped me come up with the name, but it's basically a 1 minute video of different strategies, skills, techniques about different things you could do to work on your mental performance and your mental skills. And I've been doing it for almost 2 years now. In January will be 2 years, which is absolutely crazy.
Mhm.
But the reason it started, there's two different reasons I really wanted to start this. And one was because I was constantly getting asked, like, what do you do as a mental skills coach, right? What does a mental performance coach actually do? And so
Mm.
I was like, okay, the general public needs to be educated a little bit on what we do and our roles with teams. And so I was like, I want to get that information out. And then also the second part was, you go on social media and you're just inundated with how you should physically be taking care of your body, right? You should be working out, you should be doing yoga, you should be walking every day, you should be eating this, eating that, right? It's like nonstop resources, which is amazing, and I think it's really neat, and a constant reminder that we need to be active and take care of ourselves physically. And I'm like, well, who's reminding us to take care of ourselves mentally? Like, who's helping us, know how do we check in with ourselves mentally? How do we set better goals? How do we get motivated when we aren't motivated? How do we deal with stress in our lives, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And there was not really a whole lot out there. And so I was like, how can I make this short, sweet, tangible, and something that, can not only motivate people, but get people to think on a deeper level about what they're doing. And that's where the name mental sweat came from, is because we wanted it to correlate with the idea that you're supposed to break a physical sweat every day and get active every day. It's like, technically, I would love for you to break a mental sweat every day too, and check on yourself mentally every day. And then the Monday just happened to work out great. And I think everybody could use a little boost on Mondays. And so that's why I chose to do it on Mondays. But yeah, that's what it is. It's a 1 minute video to just, it's very basic, it's very surface level, but the whole goal is just to basically introduce a concept or an idea, and then the audience to take it and run with it and figure out how it works predominantly for them. Like, how can this fit into your life, your routine, your team, your work, right? Because it's not just, I'm a big believer that it's not just for elite level athletes, right? It's for all performers. And I would argue that every human being on this earth is performing in some way, shape, or form, whether you're a spouse, a parent, you have a job, you're listening to a podcast, like, you are performing constantly. And so to me, the argument is everybody can benefit from mental performance and mental skills, and making sure they're breaking a mental sweat every day. So it was really just to kind of educate the public on what I do, but also give people a tool, something to watch, and really think about, okay, how am I getting stronger mentally? How am I taking care of myself mentally and not just physically? So that's where mental sweat came about.
Well, I framed the Mental Sweat Mondays with regard to integration
Hmm.
because not every club has the resources to be able to provide a sports psychologist, and so something like this platform gives people the opportunity to learn some mental skills, to learn some very simple sports psychology, and simple is a word here, as you said, it's at the surface level, but what I love about them, Hannah, is they don't lack nuance. So you're not simply saying punch in the air and saying be positive. There's far more nuance there. So you don't skip the nuance, and I think that's an important message. But that's a real skill to have because within a minute's not a long time. So to be able to deliver that in a minute is great. All the messages are simple, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're easy to go and apply,
Absolutely.
which is really important to say. You mentioned about setting up Mental Sweat Mondays because you want people to think about the mental side. They're bombarded with the
Hmm.
physical side. You want them to think about the mental side. And I mean,
Hmm.
I've picked a whole bunch of your Mental Sweat Mondays that I mean, I love them all, but I've picked a bunch that really grabbed me. And if we can meditate a little bit on that word think or thinking, I love the one where you talked about perhaps getting pushback from players because they might say, well, I don't want to think that much about this. I certainly don't want to think too much on the pitch or the court or the course or the
Hmm.
field. And as you quite rightly say in your Mental Sweat Monday piece there, you say, well, you know what, I don't want you to think, I don't want you to overthink, excuse me, on the pitch or the field, but I certainly want you to be thinking in your preparation. I want you to be thinking about your thinking. You say we have to simplify when performing so we can compete more and think less, but before you can simplify, you have to have a deep understanding of yourself. No question there, Hannah, but give me a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love this because I think people, again, kind of going back to the natural stigma that could potentially come with sports psychology is people thinking that the only reason I'm talking to a sports psychologist is because something's wrong,
Yep.
because I need to fix something or make an adjustment, when the reality is I don't think something has to be wrong in order for you to talk to a sports psychologist or a mental skills coach. And I think that goes hand in hand with this. And people are like, I don't want to think too much. Like, I'm already thinking a lot when I'm on the mound or when I'm performing. And I don't want to overanalyze things, because if I overanalyze things, then I'm not going to perform great. And I'm like, that's awesome. I don't want you to overanalyze either. But how are you? Do you know how to not overanalyze? Do you know
Mm,
how, if your thoughts are taking over in your mind on the mound in the moment, what to do? Do you know the strategies to use? Because if you don't think about that before it happens, odds are it's going to happen. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that, a lot of times people are like, I just don't think about anything when I perform well. And I like beg to differ that I think it's really hard to not think about anything. And if you go into a game or a big, stressful, high, tense pressure situation, like, I don't know if you're going to be able to think about nothing. And if you go into that and you're thinking, I'm not going to think about nothing, typically you're going to go to worst case scenario, right? Because we have a natural negative bias of going and finding like the worst thing that could happen all of a sudden is in the forefront of our mind and in our thoughts. And so I love thinking about, like, okay, great. If we don't want to think a lot during the game and during our performance, then we have to think a lot beforehand, because we have to have a plan, we have to have a routine, we have to have a reset routine for when we get knocked off. And then we have to have a contingency plan, right? When all else fails, what are we going to do, right? When all those negative thoughts are in our head, like, do we have a plan on how we're going to combat that and fight that and battle that? And I think that doesn't happen on the mound, right? And if you wait for it to happen on the mound or in the game, I think it's going to be too late. And so my argument is like, let's talk about it before. Let's equip you beforehand, so that regardless of what situation happens, chances of you being able to find some kind of a tool to get out of it are really high, instead of, one thing leads to another thing and all of a sudden we're in this downward spiral of performance, and we can't even catch up, right? And then the game speeds up on us, we start making silly mistakes, then it's one thing after another, instead of being able to notice it in the very beginning, stop it, have a plan, execute the plan, and then get right back on track. So I love that idea, because I think everybody thinks, well, not everybody, but I think a large part of the people who aren't like necessarily super familiar with mental skills and sports psychology, they're like, no, 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 I don't want to think too much. And it's like, I don't want you to either. So how can we avoid you thinking too much is a very common topic that I talk about with performers. So
What I've found in my work over the last 15 years is that players, competitors, participants tend to lack a framework, a mental framework to their game during the game, so in
mhm,
performance, and then they lack a strong evaluation process away from the pitch, the field, the court, the course, so that they can assess what's happening, reflect effectively, and then leave it behind so that they can go and have rest and recuperation and active recovery.
mhm.
Have you had similar experiences?
Oh yeah, I think a big piece of what we do is helping create that self-awareness around what it is, and making sure, evaluating yourself slightly during a game, right? Making small adjustments is okay, but when you're like evaluating your performance in the middle of your performance, chances are it's not going to help a ton. And so a lot of the work we do is helping them realize how to become better and more real self-evaluators, because it's pretty common to have athletes who are either seeing themselves as way better than what they actually are, or way worse than what they actually are. And I laugh because I always say, how was the game? How'd you play? How'd you pitch? How'd you hit? Whatever. And the top two answers are good or bad. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Right? Let's really work on making sure we're not just evaluating it, one, solely based on outcomes, but two, in such black and white terms, right? Like, let's actually sit down, give you some kind of a strategy that doesn't take forever either, because I know, to sit down and journal or write in a notebook, right, can be intimidating, and evaluating your performance, because everyone's like, I don't have 30 minutes to do this. And I'm like, how can we evaluate your performance in 2 to 5 minutes and you get something out of it, right? What did you do well? What do we need to work on? What did we learn from this outing? Like, and also making sure we're not just evaluating just to do it, but we're evaluating with a type of purpose that, I always challenge them to write down things in their journal that they're actually going to want to come back and read again. Don't just write it down to check off a box, right? Make it purposeful. Like, if something happened that you want to remember today, good, bad, and different, write it down, so that you're creating this workbook of who you are as a performer. And so when things aren't going well, you can go look at your list of what you're doing when things aren't going well, and see if you're doing any of those things. Or if you're trying to get back on track and feel good again, like, you have this almost cheat sheet of a book of what you do when you're performing well. And without that, writing it down, we always think we can remember it, when the reality of it is, like, we're never going to remember it. We may remember really big things, but all the little things we tend to forget so fast. So I no, creating self-awareness and creating solid evaluating skills is huge in my book.
Well, on the notion of evaluation, I picked out another Mental Sweat Monday, which was based on evaluating your performance. And in it, you do juxtapose that notion of reflecting on and evaluating bad performance versus good performances. And you suggest that players
Mhm.
often don't evaluate good, they do for bad. So they don't necessarily hold what we might call an appreciative inquiry at all. What was, when it goes well, what was good, what was
Mhm.
strong, what can I, success leaves clues, right? What can I use next time that worked today?
Mhm. What a concept, right? It's like we think, well, if you think about it, like, when you perform well and you do a good job, you're like, "Whew, yes." And it's funny because I like, so commonly it's, I either performed poorly or it was fine, right? It's neutral.
Yeah.
It's never like, wow, I performed really well today. And it's like, it's exactly that. It's like, for some reason, as high level performers, people, you hold yourself to such a high standard that, like, when it's good, it's like enough. It's not good. And I think we have a hard time of taking a step back and giving ourselves a pat on the back and saying, like, good freaking job today. When we get so just bogged down in that perfectionistic mindset, and like, nothing's ever good enough and we can always get better, which is so dangerous in my mind, because it leads to like constant unhappiness, constant like non-fulfillment. Like, we're never happy, we're never excited, we're always trying to be better, and then all of a sudden we wake up one day and we're like, I hate this sport. It's like, I wonder why, because like you're never allowing yourself to be happy and excited and, I hate using the word content, but like okay with your performance. And so I talk about that a lot. It's you can dissect the bad all you want, but you also have to make sure you're looking back and like, today was a good performance. Why? And I'm not talking about being the person in the clubhouse being loud and rowdy and like, look at me, I did so good. But it's like, at the end of the day, when you are brushing your teeth, getting ready for bed, and you just look yourself in the mirror and you're like, hey, like, great freaking job today. Like, we did it. Today was a good day. Like, having that little moment, and reinforcing that like you are working hard and you did have a good day and that's freaking awesome. I think goes a really long way, because I think we sometimes and so often hold ourselves to such a high standard that we forget to acknowledge the good, and we definitely forget to evaluate the good, which I think is crucial to continue to enjoy the sport, to continue to stay motivated in the game we're like, and to create our best performances, right? If we perform great today, why wouldn't we want to write that down? What the heck did we do today? Like, how can we emulate that? How can we do that again? And try to set ourselves up for a higher chance of success in a game that we're constantly failing at. So I think that's crucial.
You've briefly mentioned a subtle nuance difference between a practice mindset and a performance mindset. You mentioned when on the mound that there
Mhm.
can be some room for self-evaluation. There can be some space for monitoring what's happening in the moment to allow yourself to adjust. Compare to a practice session, a training session, when you might engage in deliberate practice, when you really want to turn up the volume of critique. Um, you know, I'm just interested because I think that, again, in a lot of my work is in British football, soccer, and an area I think that a lot of athletes, soccer players, athletes in all team invasion sports can improve upon is their capacity in a training situation to self-monitor, to engage in what we might call metacognition, thinking about their thinking about their behaviors, which is enormously difficult to do in a training situation, but could potentially be a hinge factor in terms of development, improvement, the small 1%. I'm fascinated to know, is that something in baseball that do you have conversations with the coaches, have conversations with the players around just being able to have a better practice mentality, deliberate practice, if you like, and are they giving them some space to think under pressure when they're actually competing?
Yeah, I love this question. So it's funny because we really started working on this and seeing this trend in the players, and really
Mm,
noticing like a very common theme is like they're hitting really well in the cages, right? And then they go into a game and it's just not there. They're just not
yeah.
as fluid. They don't look as confident. It might get a little bit more robotic. And so really like tried to dissect what's going on with that. And that's when we had some really cool conversations with coaches. And so basically how I view it is, as cliche as it is, like you practice like you play. So if there's so much technology in the game of baseball right now, which is incredible, right? Because you can track your every single tiny little move by these computers and these tracking systems, and how fast the ball hits the bat and exit velocity, right? And all of these things. And so you get so wrapped up in that while you're training, because you're trying to make small, tiny adjustments, that that's all you think about when you're practicing. And so if that's your mentality when you're practicing and your brain's focusing on all of these little things, these little technique cues, moving this, shifting this, worrying about this exit velocity, worrying about this, all of these different things, when you go into a game, you can't expect that mentality to just not be there. And so one of the things we've really been talking a lot about is, how do we have the best of both worlds, right? Because we can't just say, "Oh, well, screw that. Like we're not going to worry about technique. We're not going to worry about all," because that's how we get better. That's how we make adjustments. So we need to do that. We have to have that practice mentality of worrying about all that stuff, but we also need to practice how we're going to and what we're expected to do in a game. Which, when you ask, like, when you ask a hitter or you ask a hitting coach, like, hey, what mentality do you want to have when you're in the box? It's like as simple as it gets. Don't think about mechanics. Go out and compete, have fun, be loose, right? All of those things. But we're not ever really practicing that. And so, really trying to almost split time during practice of like, and it depends on each player, right? Sometimes it's 50-50, sometimes it's 70-30, but like making sure that they're doing the practice mentality of making adjustments, working on all of the analytical things that they need to work on. And then at the same time, like, okay, we've been working on that, which is more of an internal focus, right? You're focusing on you and what your body's doing and the adjustments you're making. And then whereas the game mentality is majority external focus, right? See ball, hit ball, reset left foul pole, watch the pitcher's hand, watch the ball, find the curve, find the spin of the ball, whatever it's doing. And you're trying to shift from internal to external with the drop of a hat, right? And so actually practicing that, and that way, when you get into a game, okay, I can either have this internal mentality or this external mentality. And I'm going to try really, really hard to have this external mentality because everything tells us that when we're focusing on something outside of our body, we're going to perform better. But if we don't ever practice that and we only practice the internal mentality, then we're going to fall back on our habits. We're going to fall back on the things that we constantly do. And so, really trying to make it a point during practice, during batting practice, in the cages, whatever it is, like very specifically, like, hey, okay, right now I'm working on my technique, and now I'm working on just seeing the ball and hitting the ball, right? Game mentality versus practice mentality. And I think that's a big separator, and the players love that, and our hitting staff is amazing, and they're all on board on that because it creates less robotics, less tension, right? That more free flowing kind of the goal of what we're trying to do is just go out and compete. And sometimes we get so locked up in making sure our form is perfect that we forget how to compete. And so we want to make sure it's this constant balance, and it's different for everybody, right? Some people are like full on compete mode all the time and have to take steps back to realize, okay, we got to work on our technique. And other people are 100% technique. And it's like, hey, we got to figure out how to let you just let loose. And so it's really individualized and figuring out what works best for each player. But some kind of balance of both is vital for me, for sure.
So what I hear you say there, because this really interests me, is moving from practice to play, the prime mediator is attentional focus.
Hmm.
And that you're finding a way to do some form of mini periodization within a session to go from an internal, uh, probably narrow
Yes.
focus on a specific technical cue
Hmm.
towards an external, again, probably narrow focus
Hmm.
onto, say, the little cues and clues that if your batsman a pitcher might give off, which demonstrates or shows which way the ball is going to be thrown,
Exactly.
pitch that's going to be coming at you. Um,
Exactly.
can I ask a question then? Can it be quite paradoxical in as much as some players turn down the volume of their thoughts and become more externally focused if you help them have just break down their mechanics into one or two simple cues that they can take out with them to have at bat. I think that's the language, right? At bat, and then because they've got those cues, they've narrowed down anything that they can think about, and that allows them to then be external as well as occasionally internal. Does that make sense? And does that actually happen?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think, again, I think it comes back to depending on what that player needs and what that player wants. And some guys like really like when they're hitting the ball, some guys are just like compete, 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 right? They call it almost like a bulldog mentality, right? Where it's like, I'm going to do everything in my power to beat this pitcher. And that's the only thing they're thinking about. While other guys are like, okay, yes, I still want to beat this pitcher and I want to compete. And the way I do that is by like keeping my weight back, right? And so they may have like one cue, and I don't even I encourage them to only have one. And we have a couple guys who are like, how about two or three? And I'm like, I don't know about that. Like I think you're gonna get too wrapped up, even though it sounds so simple. And that kind of goes back to, right, I'm okay with you having one or two small cues just to remind yourself where to set up, and then as soon as the ball's coming, you're only thinking about the ball, right? You're not necessarily thinking about weight back as you're swinging, but like maybe right before you swing, I think it's great. I just think it has to have that deeper meaning, right? And you create that by thinking about it before you get into the game. And that kind of goes back to our previous conversation just about, making sure the everything you do is because you've planned it out, right? Everything you do has some kind of a purpose. You're not just taking a deep breath because you've been told to take a deep breath. You're taking a deep breath for a specific purpose. You're saying keep your weight back for a specific purpose, because when you do that, your body reacts and responds faster or slower, or you let the ball get a little deeper, or whatever it is you're trying to do. I just want to make sure it's purposeful and not overthinking and debilitating you. So I think you can absolutely find a nice balance between maybe one internal cue, but then the last thing you're thinking about before you actually swing the bat is something external. Because and like people are wired differently, and some guys can handle that, and some guys absolutely can't. And I think that's where our job is challenging, but it's the most fun part, is really making it all individualized based on each guy. So yeah, I definitely think that's possible.
I think those who like technical cues, I've heard it being described before as a need for cognition. And this is very rife in golf. I mean, my background, Hannah, is I was a pro golfer, and golfers are very, very guilty of perhaps having a lot of technical cues at times. But for some golfers, as you said, everybody is different. And there are absolutely some golfers who thrive off two or three swing cues or keys. They have a need for cognition, which is absolutely fascinating. But you said something really interesting there. You said about there are some players who just, you almost talked about two different types of players. You talked about the player who just wants to beat the pitcher, who wants to overpower the pitcher, and then you've got others who are just perhaps maybe focusing on those, one technical cue. And I wrote down two things. I said instrumental aggression versus focus on skills. That instrumental aggression is very much, it's that very Michael Jordan-esque. I'm finding a reason to beat you. If you can give me a reason, wow, you are going to get it. And then you've got others who are a bit more cerebral, maybe that need for cognition. They surrender themselves to a focus on skills. I just think, no question there, but just absolutely fascinating that you've talked about some will just go out there, not be mechanical, not think, but just, I want to beat you. It's an instrumental aggression.
And I think it's funny because it's not a secret, but like one of my things that I constantly go back to is like, we have these perfect plans, right? We work so hard to like figure out who you are as a player, what you need in order to set you up for the best chance of success, right? Because you can do everything right in baseball and not be successful. And so I always am like, we're setting you up for the best chance of success. We're not setting you up for success, right? Because we can never guarantee that. And so, but what's funny is when all else fails, what do you do? Like in baseball, when you know where you need to be, you aren't there, you try to get there and nothing works. What do you do? Right? Like maybe you need to be at a calmer level, but you're trying to take your deep breaths, you're trying to get in the present moment, but it's not working. What do you do? And most common answer when I'm talking with these guys is, well, at that point, you almost just throw your hands up and you just say, let's compete, right? Because the competitive nature comes from a very young age. And like when they were playing when they were younger, they weren't worried about technique. They were like, I'm going to do everything I can to beat you, right? Whether it's backyard baseball or PE or whatever it is, it's like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to beat you. And so to me, it comes back to that like instrumental aggression, like you're talking about, of like, everything's failing, nothing's really working right now. So I'm going to do everything I can, regardless of how ugly it is, regardless of how it's not, it doesn't look pretty, it doesn't look succinct, whatever it is, like, but I'm going to do whatever it takes to freaking win. And it comes down to competing. And like, what do you do when nothing works? Like, what are you going to do? Like, do you give up? Do you like throw your hands up and say, forget about it? Like, I'm done. Or are you going to be like, okay, nothing's working, almost laughing about it and being like, now all I can do is compete. Right. And I think defining what that looks like for them helps too. But I think it's important to note that you're not always going to be on, and you're not always going to be able to control how you're feeling and what you're thinking. And so when you can't, what do you do? And like equipping yourself and maybe you're thinking, like competing. Yes, that's me. I just need to go compete. And maybe you're like, that doesn't work for me. Like figure out what works for you and make sure you have that when you need it the most. I think that's super important.
It reminds me of one of your mental sweat Mondays where you outlined the notion of trying harder versus trusting more.
Hmm.
And look, you may have been referring more to off-field sort of practice and day-to-day mentality, but I almost wonder if sometimes it can come to on the field as well. Having that philosophy, you talk about perhaps sort of from yourself. You used to have the philosophy of I'm not going to be outworked, but now
Hmm.
you realise that actually that self philosophy can actually be quite detrimental. That actually that can cause stress. Sometimes you just got to actually say, well, hang on a minute, I've worked as hard as I possibly can here. I've practiced
Hmm.
intelligently. I've just got to trust what I've got. So what you were saying there feels, I think what you were talking about in Mental Sweat Monday was probably more of an overarching helicopter viewpoint of how one should be on a day-to-day basis and how one should sensibly practice and go about their life. But it also has connotations for on the field as well. If it's not going so well, look, just trust what I've got, go compete. The harder
Hmm.
I try here, possibly the worse it's going to get.
Absolutely, which happens very often. And it's so hard
Mm.
because you think nothing's working, so let me try harder. Let me try to throw the ball harder. Let me try to make it spin more. Let me try to like grip the bat harder, and it's like that's the last thing we should probably be doing. And so it's in fact maybe the only thing we should do is laugh and be like, okay, it's not working, so let's just trust this and go with it and see what happens and hope for the best today, because you're gonna have off days, and accepting that every day isn't going to be a freaking perfect day, especially in sports and in life. Like every day is not going to be this awesome highlight reel of a day. And so it's like, do we let that bring us down, or are we like, okay, like let's power through it, let's get through it, and figure out what we can do best without making it even worse for ourselves. Which it's funny because I feel like it's so often our brains are telling us to do things when in fact we should do the opposite, right? In order to play better, we automatically think we need to work harder when it's actually the opposite. In order to get the results that we want, maybe we need to not try it that hard, like, and to trust ourselves. But it's this constant battle in your mind of what your natural reaction to something is, and then taking a step back and realize, I don't know if that's the best approach. Let's try this, because both are trying to get the best outcome. And one way is the way your body naturally thinks you need to do it. And the other is the way will create better chances of success for you. And I think that's hard. That's especially when in the heat of the moment, especially when you're like, no, just work hard, run, do this. And it's like, no, how do we take a step back and really figure out what is best for us in this very moment? I think that's incredibly difficult.
One of the things I say to coaches all the time is that they have a stretch dial and a support dial. And to a degree, I'll say that to players as well. You've got a stretch dial and a support dial. And we've talked a little bit there around, I think, the support dial when you take a step back and sometimes actually being the best that you can be is taking a breath, relaxing, realizing there's a lot that you can't control and
Hmm.
striving to go through the routines that you've created. And yet, I think probably why we love what we do is because high performance, especially consistent high performance, is so elusive. And as much as we can talk about support, we've also got to be able to stretch ourselves. And on one Mental Sweat Monday, you talk about how as human beings we're kind of designed for being comfortable. It's, you talk about it's in our makeup to work towards being as comfortable as possible. And I love you actually compare it to a sort of the physiological process, the homeostatic process of if we're too cold, we shiver to
Hmm.
generate heat. If we're too hot, we start to sweat to cool down. We have that homeostatic impulse. Being uncomfortable,
Hmm.
though, if we want to be the best that we can be in whatever we do have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Where did that Mental Sweat Monday come from?
Yeah, I love that. It's so funny because this is a common theme for most of my mental sweat Mondays. People ask all the time, like, how do you get your ideas? How do you get, and majority of this comes from like my personal experience, right? Like doing mental sweat Mondays is incredibly uncomfortable, right? It's gotten better over the span of a year and a half, right? But like it is incredibly uncomfortable to try to give information in 1 minute that's still valuable, right? That's not just like saying be positive, like you said in the beginning, right? It's incredibly challenging and incredibly uncomfortable, but it's like in order to do things like, right? Like in order to know what your full potential is, in order to stretch yourself, in order to do these things that you want to do and accomplish the things you want to accomplish, you have to get
Mm.
uncomfortable. And that is so hard for us as human beings because we literally constantly strive to be comfortable. Like unconsciously striving to be comfortable. And I had a really cool conversation the other day just about how even when you're doing something that you know is going to be great for you, that's going to be this awesome opportunity you want to do, you're still panicking or, very emotional about it because it's so uncomfortable. But yet we know it's going to be beneficial. But that doesn't change the fact that we're uncomfortable doing it. And that is not a feeling that we love or enjoy. Like everyone's like, get uncomfortable. And it's like, great. That's so much easier said than done. But if you look at like the best of the best in their fields and what they're doing, and you look at the best of the best players, like they do things, they put themselves in situations that are constantly uncomfortable, that are constantly pushing them in ways that may feel like they're not good at what they're best at in the whole world. Like imagine that, right? Like you're really good at something and then you do something within that field or that sport that makes you feel like you're not good at all. And it's like, wait, this is like how I like value myself. This is what I put my worth in, right? Whether it's your work or your sport. And now I feel like I'm not good at it or like I am, way behind in the process. Whatever it is, like nobody wants to feel that. And so it's natural for us to not want to be uncomfortable, but in order to do the things we want to do and stretch ourselves and to figure out what our full potential is, we have to constantly be in that uncomfortable state. And so it actually came from like my personal experience, which a lot of them do, which is really funny. But especially in the pandemic. Are you kidding? Like, right? And all the stuff that's going on in the world right now, like it's all uncomfortable. Like none of us like this, what's happening. None of us like being cooped up at home wearing masks. Like it's brutal, but in order to get to where we want to get, we have to do these things. And it's so hard, but and it's a constant challenge. And it's almost just like you have to accept that this is going to be uncomfortable, that this isn't going to be fun at first. But my goodness, if I do this, like the reward, what's at the end of this is going to be way more fulfilling than how scary it was to do it in the first place. But it's hard to see that. And step one, it's hard to see that.
So how I think that's all really well said, and I'm curious as to how baseball players do that. So, is that, and I'm sure this involves coaches. Are they setting stretch task goals, for instance, or just stretch
Hmm.
performance and outcome goals? Are they constraining a player's environment in practice that
Hmm.
means it's harder for them to perform, and so that they're learning? Are they setting consequences for failure of some kind of practice session, which means that they've got to do a consequence that feels desperately uncomfortable? How does that work out on the field and in your day to day
Yeah.
life?
Yeah, so I think there's not a ton, at least I'm not aware of a ton of drills where it's like if you don't do it right, there's consequences.
Mm,
But we do implement a lot of drills for both pitchers and hitters where failing is very normal. Where like this is supposed to be so difficult that if you actually succeed, it's the anomaly.
yeah.
Because and like at first, like first reaction, they're like, oh, we hate this. Like this is awful, and it's really funny to kind of see how different players react to it. But then after time and time again, they actually start to see success. And this is way significantly harder than like in game situations. And so you're preparing them to handle things that maybe they wouldn't be able to handle. So I mean, even on the pitching side, we have them doing um like fielding, right? Because you don't really think a ton about pitchers and them fielding an actual ball and making plays, and like they run them ragged because that's like one of the things that pitchers fail at most often is like even just throwing the ball to first because you just so tunnel visioned in on throwing the ball and throwing it how you should, and so it's a lot of pushing them and putting them in situations where we know they're going to fail. And it's interesting just to see the different techniques of the coaching staff. Sometimes they'll tell them, hey, this drill is set up for you to fail. And sometimes they won't. And so it's like maybe the players go into it thinking it's just a normal drill, and all of a sudden they're failing 9 out of 10 times. And they're like, what is this? Right. And questioning. So they're definitely put in uncomfortable situations. They're put in situations where they're failing, where failing is absolutely normal. And just to create that sense of, like, this is incredibly challenging. This is incredibly uncomfortable. I don't like this feeling, but if we keep doing it, like, it's going to make the feeling in a game so much better. So I don't think there's a ton of consequences, but there's definitely a ton of failing in practice for sure.
I love the notion of a coach priming or not priming
Mm-hmm.
failure, and probably noticing the different reactions of the players as they go through the task. And obviously, turning up the dial of task difficulty is such a great way to stretch players. The consequence thing, Hannah, was really, really interesting. I was with a group of teenage golfers, late teenage golfers, the other day, and I talked to them about consequences, and I asked them to decide whatever consequence they wanted to have. They played 9 holes, and it was the loser, the one who had the highest score. The others were allowed to send a text message to anybody that they wanted to on this player's phone.
Oh
Yes, well,
gosh.
your reaction exactly. And what was amazing, I mean, these were very, very good golfers. You were talking about some who have official world golf ranking in the amateur ranks, very good golfers. And one of them, who was one of the better players, who has quite a high ranking, absolutely wilted and folded and really struggled. And it was a wonderful way to, obviously it was policed. It was policed in terms of the text wasn't too bad, but it was a wonderful way to test the mental skill of young players. Consequences it can be
I love it.
fun, it can be effective,
Yeah.
it can be brutal as well. But there's other ones, like just I have agreements between coaches and players that if the player doesn't achieve a certain thing, the player has to wash the car of the coach, or something like that, which doesn't make them nervous. It's just a pain in the backside to have to do that. And so it really brings a sense of positive intent and a sense of realistic pressure into the game.
Absolutely. And I think that's great. And I think it's fun. I think it's annoying. I think it's emotional. And I think that's, and anytime you can bring that emotion into it, and that sense of competitiveness, and that sense of, like, there is a chance that we could fail at this, and maybe the chance is high, like, all you're doing is getting them more reps of how to compete in a productive way, right?
Yeah,
In a way where, right? Because you're giving that situation, and now they want to try really hard. And maybe if they try really hard, they're going to fail. And so all of a sudden they start to realize, oh my gosh, if I try really hard, I'm going to fail. So for me to get the results that I want and be successful and not have to do this punishment, then I actually don't need to try this hard. And, like, I think if you can teach that in fun ways, in non-game experiences, right, it's going to help them to know how to handle it better in the game. I think anything like that is really cool and fun, and usually, and, like, again, going back to just the competitive nature of the game, like, if you can find something like that, they typically love it. And that brings back the piece of enjoyment too, which I think is vital for success. And sometimes you forget how fun it can actually be. And so anything to help them, to remind them, like, the reason we love competing so much is because it's actually fun, and because there's a chance we're going to fail. And the time we succeed is the time we didn't fail. And that's why it's so good, because we didn't fail, because the odds were against us. We were supposed to fail and we didn't. And that's why we enjoy it so much, and reminding them of that.
absolutely, absolutely. Listen, I'd like to finish on one of your more recent Mental Sweat Monday posts: optimism versus positivity. Um,
Yeah.
Tell me, Hannah, what's the difference?
Yes. So I love this. I love this conversation because I think people, believe it's one and the same. And I mean, you can argue that they are both similar. And your interpretation of either one of them, it may be
Hmm.
great. But the way I view it is, you know, you'll never hear me say, like, hey, just go be positive out there. Like, just like you said in the very beginning, like, none of my Mental Set Monday videos, none of my one-on-one conversations, never have I ever been quoted like, we just got to go out there and be positive, because I don't think that's productive to our performance, right? I view positivity as like everything around you is on fire, right? Everything's going wrong, nothing's working, and you're sitting there like, hey, it's okay. Like, we're going to be all right. And it's like, is it okay? Like, are we going to be all right? Like, and does that work? Or does the like, BS meter in your head go off when you say things like that, right? Is it like, no, I don't, okay, yeah, everything's going to be fine. Right. No way. Versus, so it's almost like trying to slap a band-aid on a really, really bad situation, and not really acknowledging how bad the situation is, which is what I think optimism is, right? Optimism to me is you see the situation for what it actually is. Okay, everything's on fire around us. It's not going great right now. I'm not performing well right now. I can't figure out what to do. And at the same time, I know if I, right, going back to like, I know if I don't try too hard, I can set myself up for success. So I'm not going to try to overdo it right now. I'm just going to trust my training and hope for the best, and just hope, and like have a little bit of faith that, like, you know what, all I can do is do what I do, control what I can control, and maybe it'll turn around. Or, yes, this pitcher is really good. This opponent is really good and we're struggling right now, but that doesn't mean the game's over, right? Like, there's still a chance, like we could still do this, we could still do that. So it's optimism to me is seeing the situation for what it actually is, and putting a little bit of optimistic on top, right? Like a little optimistic cherry on top of it, right? It's not pretending like what's happening isn't happening. It's acknowledging it and accepting it, and choosing to like say, okay, we can still do this. We can still fight. We can still battle. We can still compete, versus like, right, the pessimistic side is seeing it for what it actually is and being like, yeah, we're done. Like, there's not a chance. We don't have a chance. And so I just think that's so much more powerful. Is I'm always about real. I'm always about acceptance and about awareness. And so I think if you can be aware, acknowledge the situation at hand, because it's not going to help to pretend like the situation isn't happening, and then decide how you're going to handle it and how you're going to attack it, and then hope for the best. I think that's the best combination of steps, and the mindset to again give you the best chance of success in a really bad situation. So
No, I agree, and I mean, look, you're at the Philadelphia Phillies, and Pennsylvania, Penn State. Penn State is the birthplace of positive psychology. The great work of Martin Seligman. I'm thinking of his work on learned optimism. The two words that came to mind as you were speaking there, Hannah, control and specificity. Optimism. I think encompasses what one can control. If I focus on what I can control and I go and execute that, then I can be optimistic about the outcome. I don't 100% know if the outcome is going to be a positive one, but I can be, I can work on being optimistic. And then that specificity piece, I think optimism is much more specific, and much more towards specific things that you can go and focus on and execute, rather than this somewhat bland notion of be positive. That's how I would interpret some of what you've said there.
yes, exactly.
Fantastic. I suppose last question for you. What's been your favourite ever mental sweat Monday? What's the one, maybe we've mentioned it already, but what's the one that's resonated with you the most?
Ooh, I love that question. I think my favorite is the ones about confidence, just because I think that resonates with me and my work the most. And I think there's been a couple, but it's basically a message about confidence. And right, we talked about, on one hand, creating your own confidence, right? You have to be your own source of confidence if you want it and when you need it the most. But it's also knowing that I don't think you have to be confident to perform your
Mm.
best. And I think that's like really, for most performers, it's like, what? Like, yeah, all I want to do is I just need to be confident out there and I'll perform well. And it's like, well, I always ask the question, have you ever been really confident and performed poorly? And, everyone's like, well, yeah. And I say, well, have you ever not been confident and gone out and played okay or really good? And they're like, well, yeah. And so I'm like, so what does that tell us? Like, to me, like, as much as we like to feel confident, there's not really a direct correlation to feeling confident and performing great. Like, you don't have to feel confident in order to perform great. And so I love that conversation because people are like, what? No. And then by the end of it, they're like, okay, okay. And so just really talking about the importance of feelings, and that the most important part of your feelings is how you're interpreting it and how you're messaging your body, and how you're choosing to respond. Just because you feel a certain way doesn't necessarily mean you're going to act a certain way. And I think that's incredibly important for performance. You don't have to feel confident to play confident. And I love that, just because it's so opposite, I think, of what mainstream media tells us to be, like how to be more confident in everything we do. And we love that feeling of confidence, but just because you don't feel that doesn't mean all of a sudden you're just done, and I love talking about that.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. I've had a few conversations about confidence on the Sports Psych show in the past with people, and there's a link between a feeling of confidence and being a challenge state rather than a threat state.
Mm.
Equally, I had conversations with practitioners and coaches who have said, "Well, I'm not a great believer in worrying too much about confidence. It exists, but I'm not too concerned."
Hmm.
Um, I suppose if I reflect on my own practice, I'm I'm similar and dissimilar to you in as much as I try to broaden the conversation. I certainly want to have a conversation around what things can help build confidence because, well, why not?
Right.
However, I think you're 100% right in as much as I think one of the most important conversations we can also have, which feels very sort of along the mental contrasting literature here, which is when you're not confident, what are you going to do? When you're
Hmm.
not confident, how are you going to go about that? And that conversation probably extends to, you see, it's not the end of the world if you don't feel confident. Let's work on things to be confident, but equally, let's be robust and flexible enough that if you're not confident, you've got some strategy, you've got ways to deal with that, or you just carry on as usual.
I love it. Exactly. And not panic.
And and not panic. Focus on you and be as in one of your mental sweat Mondays. You talk about focus on you and be the best version of yourself, and that's all that you can do.
Yes, I love it.
Awesome. Listen, Hannah, thank you so much. That was brilliant. I know you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. I know now that the people who listen into this podcast will be keen to listen into Mental Sweat Monday for sure. So, how can they find you? How can they follow you?
Yeah, so it's pretty easy. My Instagram is just Hannah Huesman, first and last name, and then Twitter I think is Hannah_Huesman, and then LinkedIn is just my name. So it's not too hard to find it.
Brilliant, perfect, and I can't recommend them enough. They're so brilliant. They are simple, but they are nuanced, and I think everybody, if you listen in every week, you'll get a ton of great advice, techniques, information. So I can't recommend them enough. Hannah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey Dan, thanks for having me. Great conversation.
Brilliant. Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.